Hey, listener name, ready to dig into something a little different today.
We're diving into Genesis,
Okay.
but not the stories you usually hear.
Right.
We're talking about Esau,
Uh-huh.
yep, Jacob's brother,
Yeah.
and his descendants, the Edomites.
Okay.
Often Genesis 36, which details this, gets skimmed over. But trust us,
Yeah.
it's full of juicy historical and cultural insights.
I think that's something that a lot of people miss, when we think about these what seem to be like minor figures in the biblical narrative, how much they really impact everything, even folks that we meet later. And they have these really important legacies that really kind of set the scene for what happens later on.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, this whole idea of Esau becoming so wealthy
Yeah.
that he has to move, like he has to relocate his entire entourage to Mount Seir to prevent conflict with Jacob.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of, like, Isaac and the Philistines,
Yeah.
you know?
It's really interesting. It's almost like this kind of a recurring theme, right? Like you have these kind of like resource constraints and then kind of this sort of it's not quite a rivalry, but it's definitely this tension,
Yeah.
that seems to happen over and over again.
Yeah.
And this move to Mount Seir wasn't just a logistical thing. I mean, obviously they needed more space, right?
Yeah.
But it was hugely symbolic.
Right. Yeah.
This idea of kind of like, separating yourself, establishing your own identity,
Yeah.
really kind of creating a distinct path.
It's like they're forging their own path. And I mean, it's interesting because you get to this part in Genesis 36, and it's laying out this surprisingly sophisticated structure for Edomite society.
Yeah.
It mentions leaders referred to as dukes.
Right.
And I don't know about you, but like when I hear duke, I'm kind of thinking Game of Thrones.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it has that kind of a ring to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But in the ancient Near East, that was like a real political power. Think of it more like a regional governor or like a powerful chieftain.
So they weren't just like a tribe.
No, they were not just a tribe. I mean, they were really intentionally building something that was structured and organized, much like their neighbors. I mean, this was a society that had a plan.
And it really makes you re-examine the entire Esau narrative. A lot of times we get caught up in that whole birthright story.
Yeah, for sure.
But his legacy extends way beyond that.
Totally.
And it's so interesting how, Jacob gets the spiritual legacy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then Esau kind of takes this path that leads to like land and power and influence in the physical world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like you see these two different like trajectories.
Right.
And I think for a long time, and we don't have to necessarily get into this, but there's been this kind of tendency to kind of like, prioritize one over the other.
Yeah.
Right. But I think, what's really fascinating is to see like how they both play out and how this actually impacts, the biblical narrative going forward.
Right. And I think what's really interesting too is that they pop up in prophecies.
Oh, yeah.
We have this very complex relationship with the Israelites.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, we could spend a lot of time unpacking that relationship because I think there's a tendency to want to simplify it. But the reality is it's very messy.
Yeah.
It's very complicated. And it's interesting to see how that, again, kind of like plays out over time. But I think, what's really kind of, what really brings it to life for me is when we start to look at like the archaeology.
Right.
And like the historical texts that are outside of the Bible. What do those tell us about the Edomites?
Yeah. I mean, what kind of picture do those paint?
Well, for one thing, they were really good with their hands. Like they were known for being incredibly skilled metal workers, especially when it came to copper, which makes sense when you think about their location, right? Modern day Jordan. I mean, that put them right in the middle of some pretty major trade routes.
Right.
So they've got control over valuable resources. They're controlling the flow of goods. It's no wonder that they show up in the historical record, as this kind of like regional power.
Yeah.
So I think, for me, what's really important to remember is that, we can't just look at kind of like the biblical narrative in isolation. Right. We have to look at it within this larger context. And I think, when we start to do that, it really enriches our understanding of kind of like who these people were and how they fit into this larger story.
And I think that's important for us because even though we're thousands of years removed from this,
right,
these stories still impact us.
Absolutely.
They still have something to teach us. It's not just some, dry, dusty old scroll.
No.
These are real people with real lives.
Real drama.
Real drama.
Yeah.
And it really makes you wonder how many other of these kind of like seemingly insignificant characters
Right.
have these amazing stories
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
we just haven't even, you know.
That we haven't even scratched the surface of.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So, next time you're reading through Genesis and you get to Esau, don't just gloss over it.
right. Don't just think, oh yeah, that's the birthright guy.
Right.
Exactly.
There's more to it.
There's a whole other story there.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Until next time, listener.